wholesale change in our society so that we don't have to fight over some of those racial issues that we had then, such as the segregation. We don't have to go to separate fountains. So we take all the gains that were part of that package, we take those for granted. However, we've seemed to think that because we've lagged behind economically, and that's something subject to dispute as well, but they say because we've lagged behind economically, then perhaps we need to simply just address that. And then we want to separate that from this other thing. And so we're saying integration was the problem. Well, but integration was also the solution. Okay. And so we can't really separate those things out, because in that package that had us on the upward trajectory had economic justice, it had political justice, it had police justice, it had social justice, it had all these things were part of the package, and we were coming up together. When you begin separating those things out, then and you're addressing them one by one, it's a different movement.
So is it mutually exclusive? In other words, could we not have had the autonomy of building a Black economy while creating integration and social reform for those other things?
Yeah, see, that's tough. That's tough, because when you say, well, we're going to create our Black economy, then what does that do? By virtue of that Black economy, you've kind of segregated and you separate it out. And so the movement, Dr. King, his big push was always integration, and we needed to have the ability to say, okay, when we integrate, and Dr. King, he used to speak about this all the time. He said, when we integrate, there are going to be new challenges for us as a people when we integrate. And it was going to be, how do I not just sell to a smaller segment? How can I market to this bigger segment? How can I create a product for everybody? And that was the challenge of integration. So when people say, well, but we need to do the Black thing, okay, you can say that, but that's kind of a different agenda than the one Dr. King had. And so, and because it says, well, but I only want to create for this smaller segment. I only want to create, and people have, and that's what justice does. That's what freedom does. It gave us the opportunity to do that. You could do that, but Dr. King had a package where all these things were going to roll in together. And so when you saw education, it wasn't that that we had just millionaires, billionaires. It was that we had access to jobs, whether it was teacher, whether it was electrician, plumbing. We had access to jobs. That raised the standard of economic level for.
And we have to disrupt that. Well, the unification of the Negro, period, full stop. But then after the interview, or not after, but the continuation of it was, we have to stop that at any cost, because that's a threat to our republic. So the government, the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigations, essentially set out on a mission, if you will, to disrupt Black economic progress, because that would be a threat. And then I'm hearing, to bring it full circle to the current electorate, that what we're seeing, over 100 million people have already voted. They said that the states that we traditionally view as red states are states that are underrepresented, not because of the fact that there's a greater population of red voters than blue voters. The blue voters just have been dormant. And now something's got them pissed off, or someone. So now we got all these people that are the sleeping dragon, so to speak, is waking up all across the country.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see as we get those returns in. Tonight, everybody will be glued to their TV to see what has happened, because there have been, and historically, there are always those charges of voter suppression and oppression of those people to vote. And so we're going to see what happened, because are those record numbers, are they indicative of the fact that we have identified that animal that has done that, and that now these people have an opportunity to be heard? And so I think we'll see tonight. It'll be interesting to see.
Oh man, you're right. I just had a meeting with a gentleman, African American gentleman, professional, and he was saying that his son, who's only 12 years old, and that school is one of the voter hubs that they. He said, "Dad, I'm scared to go to school tomorrow." And he said, "Why, son?" He said, "Because I don't know what's going to happen. It could be like a revolution." Now this poor boy is a 12-year-old child that is scared to go to school, and the question is, when we were 12, we weren't thinking about elections or any of this stuff, man. We couldn't care less, So now it's a different dynamic. And young people are more socially woke now than any other time in our collective history, I think. So then the question around that is do we feel like after this whole thing is resolved that we will be able to get back to this place of civility where we're recognizing race as some sense of social equality again?
Well, we got to get back on the trajectory. We got to head back up. And so what that means is it's going to take work. And what I think has happened, like I said, when I said the leadership kind of took a vacation, then we stopped doing the work. And what I think is happening is, whether it's the Trump administration or the Obama administration, I think it's awakened workers. It's awakened leaders. We need more people who step to the forefront and say, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to sacrifice my life. Dr. King, he gave his life to begin this movement or that movement. We're going to need people who do that. And I think that's going to be the change. And so yeah, as Dr. King used to say, he said, the change doesn't roll in on the wheels of inevitability. It's not just going to happen.
Right.
It's going to happen as a result of people deciding this change needs to happen and them doing things to make that happen. And so kind of like the guy I had on my program there, that's the kind of stuff that we're trying to do, because yeah, it's not just going to happen. We've got to make it happen. And it can happen, and that's the beauty of it. It can happen the way that we want to, knowing what needs to happen.
Right.
Having understanding the history and understanding the coalition and the consensus that we've got to build. It can happen in a very good way that does not have to be divisive, does not have to cost people their lives that way.
Yes.
We can do this thing, and everybody uses the cliche word together now, because everybody's saying together.
Right.
You got Trump and Biden saying together, and then they talk, the next breath they both talking about each other bad. But
right.
But we can do that in a very constructive manner. We really can.
Wow. Well said. Well said. So folks, those just joining us, you are listening to the Natural Nation Network. This is Voters Edition today. I am here with Carlin Charleston, the head of Erase Race and the Racial Equality Movement. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to delve in a little bit more on the history and what has led to our current crisis now. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back in just a moment.
Every sports fan knows that the last few minutes can change the game. Texas has had record voter turnout, but it's not over yet. Voting is not a spectator sport. You have the power to change the game. We need everyone to get off the bench and get involved. We can't afford 4 more years of this administration. Get out and vote this Tuesday, November 3rd. Paid for by Texas Black Democratic PAC.
Are you a small business owner concerned about the downturn in the economy? Top business leaders like Mattress Mac and Warren Buffett will tell you that now is the time to promote your business more than ever. People need your services. Your business needs an edge. Learn about special advertising packages for small businesses right here on Edge Radio. Find out more, give us a call at 281-744-0446. That's 281-744-0446. Edge, because truth still matters. And we are back. This is the Edge Radio Network. Go to edgeradiotv.com. Be sure to connect on all our social media. We want to build a tribe, and we want this tribe to be integrated, educated, and motivated to do what's necessary to effect change. And that's why I love talking to Carlin here, because you have been an agent of change for a number of years. And I hesitate to ask you. I won't say who you're voting for. My question is, you're somewhat apolitical. I mean, I listen to your show. I love what you and Richard talk about, and please tell Richard I miss him and love him. I love his energy. He's a big, giant, gentle giant, of a man. I hope you're watching, Rich, and I hope you're getting better. But so you land in sort of that neutral space, it seems like.
Oh, yeah. And I have to for the type of work that I'm doing, because I realize that if you're going to be about unity, because unity is taking people on polar sides of an issue and saying, where can we find common ground and work together? And so, and the minute you become on the side, you go to the one side of that polar extreme, you're no longer of any value to the other side. Mm-hmm. And so it's so important to be able to do that, and definitely in the work that I'm doing. And the other part of that is it's also very personally challenging to be able to understand people on both sides. Because I was telling somebody the other day, I really can't do this. And I challenged myself personally. I said, I can understand why people love Trump. I can understand why people hate Trump. Mm-hmm. I can understand why people love Biden. I can understand why people hate Biden. I said, and so it's when you put yourself in that position, and that's the ultimate, because that's where we've got to go to this empathy where you can understand, because then when you talk to people, you don't name call them, right. Because you understand, and you understand their viewpoint. And it's something about in our unity movement, we talk about that's what's necessary to foster the relationships necessary for us to come up with solutions. Because right. At the end of the day, anything that I say or do matters nothing to anybody. My children and grandchildren don't benefit if it's not a solution that works for our country. And so that's what's got to happen.
Wow.
Yeah.
So walking that fence, you're going to have your antagonist that'll say, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. Mm-hmm. And right now, this is what I've heard from the Republican GOP side. Mm-hmm. There's a shadow government that has been in control and that has been running towards a socialist agenda. They want to destroy the economy. They want to destroy the core industries, oil and steel and manufacturing in this country. And that's why we're Trumpsters, because by golly, we got to end this. Now, we almost find that in any point of view, there is some vestiges of truth.
Sure.
How do you see that perspective?
Oh, and here's a great chance for me to explain that. So I think that hopefully everybody can get it. If you don't get it, it's my fault because I haven't explained it well enough.
Okay.
But I want to talk about this concept of narratives, okay? Because narratives are the stories. These are the stories that are being told. Mm-hmm. And so you could say that there's a Republican narrative. You could say there's a Democratic narrative. And you could say there are various narratives even within that. You could say there's a liberal narrative and a conservative narrative. And these narratives take facts, mm-hmm. and they create a story around those facts. And that's why they always have this element of truth. But you could take those facts and you'll create a narrative which by itself is not in itself true. And so while the facts that are part of that, and that's why you hear so many people, when these politicians especially, they'll tell a story of something that happened, and it supposedly supports the narrative that mm-hmm. our healthcare system is this way or that way,
right.
That something is broken this way, that our policing system is this way or that way, because I took a story, and that story, which was factual, then feeds into a narrative. Now I have a narrative that says this is true. Mm-hmm. So this is happening, and the police forces kill all of our black men. They kill off because I took some stories to show that these things are facts, and it happens. So it supports the narrative.
Right.
And so what we've got to do, if we really want to resolve the issues, we've got to understand that there are narratives, and we have to have a counter narrative. And so our counter narrative, which would do the same thing, we would take stories, and for instance, because my narrative is that your narrative I understand because it does have this essence of fact on both sides. My narrative is to say, let's take the knowledge we have of those facts and let's come up with a solution together that addresses the facts that were part of your narrative. So I don't reject their narrative. Their narrative is true and very true to them, regardless of what it says as the end result. That narrative is true to them because of the stories resident that are a part of that narrative. But I have to offer a counter narrative. And it's almost like you got these campaigns happening. We need people who have their own personal campaign that can address the narratives that are out there. And because there are narratives in every area of our lives, we need counter narratives that are good for everyone.
Yes,
So-
yes. Well, when you're talking about narratives, to me, I'm inevitably confronted by the biases that now exist in media. When you watch MSNBC
Mm-hmm.
and the same story on Fox News,
Yes.
it is absolutely a different story.
And they're covering the same set of facts.
That's right.
They're covering the same facts.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That's disconcerting. And one thing that I have to say, and I give them credit, I consider myself media to a degree in terms of what we do here at Edge Radio.
Mm-hmm.
I have to give these guys credit because they're brilliant at spinning the narrative. I mean, they literally will get you convinced that this is what's happening. Our borders are being overrun, if that's the narrative.
That's why you got to watch both. You
Right,
got to watch
right.
both sides.
Right,
You know?
right. But I guess the question then becomes, who's buttering their bread? Because if when I see, for an example, here on Natural Nation, those who watch the show know, I'm a former certified health and wellness practitioner. I've worked with people, helping them to restore their body to health, and worked with naturopathic doctors. And when I listen to a pharmaceutical ad, sometimes it's a personal affront to me. I try to be, I try to say, yeah, there's room for this. But then when I hear may cause nose bleeding, diarrhea, death, I'm like, whoa, he just said death. Is death worth my sinuses? Like, really, man? Now the dog is running through the lily field and there's cartoons around at the part where they're telling me this thing can kill me.
Yeah.
Like, there's something, so to me, it's almost like, I listen to these narratives, but sometimes the narratives can be very destructive to society.
Yes.
And how do you react to that when the narrative itself is is clearly false and is deleterious to the social fabric and the mission that you espouse?
Yeah, that's why there's got to be that counter narrative. And the thing is, it's got to be profitable. The only reason people choose certain narratives is because there's some profit in it for them.
Yeah.
And so whether that be economic, whether that be social, there are things that make it beneficial for me to espouse this narrative. And so people will do that. It might be that I fit in with my family. I fit in with this group if I espouse this narrative, because my family's always espoused this narrative and I've got to be in good with them. And when I say family, that could just be based on skin color. It can be based on anything, right. So people will do that. And so what we need to do is we need to have something that is better. We really do. We need to have something that's better. And that's the thing, because you're going to have to sit people down to advertise to them why it is better. You've got to have a platform to explain to them that it is better. That's why here at Edge Radio Network, we've got something that is a little bit different. It's not Fox, it's not MSNBC, but we think we have something that will make you think, that will make you look at both Fox and MSNBC and begin asking the right questions.
Right.
And so that's what's got to happen. And because I think in that there is inherent value. There is the value that, number one, I can begin thinking for myself. And when I look at them, I don't look at them to receive information. I look at them to analyze and critique the information that I'm getting.
Yes.
That's the value that we have here at Edge Radio when we bring that.
Yes.
Right. So,
Man, you're a smart dude. No, you're exactly right. You're spot on. But people do become entrenched in their beliefs and the fears that they have. I've told this story off camera with you, but I remember a gentleman came in about maybe a month or so ago, and we were talking about the election. He's an NRA. He's one of the leaders in the NRA here in Texas. Texas is big gun country. We are number one amount of guns are in Texas.
Yeah, Texas.
Yeah, that's right. Everything's bigger in Texas. Gun toters.
That was my Marine side coming out. My Marine side.
Hoorah! Yeah. Hey, look. But what was disconcerting is I asked him, and I didn't ask him. I wish I was interviewing him, because he was being interviewed for a BBC thing that was being done here in our studio. And I said to him, so, sir, let me ask you, what do you believe is going to happen in this election if your side is defeated and the NRA is dealt a blow? Because clearly the Dems want to control this. He said, there's a few things I'm willing to die for. And one of them is trying to take my arms. They're going to take it, pry it out of my cold, dead hands. And the man looked me right in the eye and said, there's going to be a civil war. And I went, are you serious right now? He said, oh, there's going to be a civil war. And I went, gosh. Now, right at about that time, I remember they interrupted us, and because my next question, which I would have loved to ask on the airwaves, is, okay, so you got AK-47s. So those are pretty badass weapons, right? You know, you got a lot of those. You take out the buck in them, or whatever that is. You guys are, all right. So when a Black Hawk helicopter and Navy SEALs drop out of the sky, is that AK-47 gonna mean anything? Because those guys, you guys, I mean, I say those guys, you're a former Marine, my brother. I'm scared of you because I know you're a bad dude. And so you cannot convince me that some militia, I don't care if they have AK-47s, are gonna take on a tank or a Black Hawk or a drone that's flying overhead. So what is this revolution really gonna be about? People getting killed?
Well, you know, and guys who espouse what you're saying, those militiamen and things like that, they have their narrative is a little bit different than the narrative that you're espousing. Because what they believe is those guys who were dropping out of those helicopters and all that, they think those guys are on their side. And that's what they're viewing. So their plan is that these guys are going to be on our side. They've got those people in their corner.
We're about to go to break. As a Marine, as a lieutenant in the Marine Corps, if you knew that you had to go up against men, women, and children that were militia gun toters, and you were assigned, and you were told by your military commander, suppress this, what would you do, Carlin? What would you do?
So a civil war in 2020, as you're saying, if we're having because, you know, we've never entertained this in the time I was an active duty Marine from 1985 to 2005, we never entertained such a thought. But now is that it's come real. The thought is, if I were active, I'm not sure what I would do.
Oh man, I was going to say we should have asked that question before the break.
Yeah. So,
all right, I'll
think about it during the break.
We're up against a break, folks. You're listening to the Natural Nation Network. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we are joined by Carlin Charleston. We're talking about this current voting state. So we'll be back in just a moment here on the Edge Radio Network.
Every sports fan knows that the last few minutes can change the game. Texas has had record voter turnout, but it's not over yet. Voting is not a spectator sport. You have the power to change the game. We need everyone to get off the bench and get involved. We can't afford 4 more years of this administration. Get out and vote this Tuesday, November 3rd. Paid for by Texas Black Democratic PAC.
The Natural Nation Network is really about taking control of your health physically, spiritually, emotionally, even intellectually, because there's so much out there in misinformation. There's a lot of people now that are suffering from all sorts of diseases that they really wouldn't have to suffer for if they had better information. And that's what we're here to do. Provide information that can save lives.
The mind and the body are totally connected.
Health can be really serious, and you know, sometimes we just have to lighten it up a little bit while we're still providing substantive information. And you know, my sort of mantra on the salsa dance floor is kind of similar. You know, I tell somebody, if you make a mistake twice, it becomes a move. Okay.
Tune into Natural Nation every Tuesday at 11 a.m.
And we are back. You are listening to the Natural Nation Network here on Edge Radio TV. We have been having a great political conversation. Folks, today is November 3rd. Today is the day that some of you have been waiting for 4 long years. And so now it's time to get out and get your vote out. Make sure it counts. If you got to stand online, that's the price you pay for your freedom to express and vote for the next leader of this country. So just before our break, we're talking to Carlin, who is a former Marine and officer in the Marine Corps. And I was asking the hypothetical question, and I'll circle back again because it's a great question. If there was this social unrest like we're seeing in Portland, they're calling it Portganistan right now. Wow. What is the criteria by which the military intervenes? If one of the leaders say, shut them down, not lock them out, what happens?
Well, first of all, we've got federal statutes that prevent the military, Department of Defense, from intervening in domestic matters. It's called Posse Comitatus, and it is a statute that says that we cannot be used for policing activities in the states. Now, of course, with the advent of executive orders by president, there are a lot of things that presidents are now doing these days, both Obama and Trump, that kind of give the executive branch the opportunity to do some things before. But by statute, we can't be used for such. And so we don't have to think about that because we are not to be used for domestic affairs. And so that would be a domestic affair. And so they would have to circumvent some federal statutes in order to make that happen. And now, if you want to ask the question, if they in fact did do that, then it would, we would have to determine, and there would be some series of events as to why they would do that. And I think those events would be important for us in determining what action we played, because, the Marines, we are kind of I wouldn't say a renegade bunch, but when all the other services were saying, you've got to allow gays and things in, Marines were standing saying, we don't have to, So we're kind of the last people, and we're kind of a conservative branch. And so it would determine what happened with our leadership. Would our leadership kind of buck the system and say, no, Marines aren't going to do that? Because then every Marines follow, like Jack Nicholson said in A Few Good Men, Marines follow orders or people die. Once that commandant makes that statement, then the Marines would be pretty much in line saying, we're not going to do it.
Wow.
But if that guy said, yes, we're going to do that, then the Marines would do it. Wow. Because that's the way Marines said. They have this undying devotion to their commander.
Yes.
And they preach that stuff. And as I was saying, they brainwash kind of, I hate to say that, Marines, my fellow Marines, but, but we're that dedicated to the cause. And when that leader says do it, we will do it.
Yes, no, I have eminent respect. I know my brother, Marine, and I've seen the discipline and all the wars and everything he's been involved in, and much respect. So let me go back in history a little bit and just ask this and educate the audience at the same time. Back in 2001, when the trade towers were hit, there was an act that was passed called the Patriot Act. But some research has determined that the Patriot Act was actually written before 9/11. And the Patriot Act, for those of you who don't know this, remember when, for those of you who have, that were around, some 20-year-olds would not remember this, but remember we would go from level red to level orange to level yellow, and we're back and forth. We're at a level red emergency, and terrorists are going to blow us up with their shoes and their underwear and whatever. We were, pouring out our liquid lotions at the airports, and it was just a hot mess. And fact of the matter was that when the Patriot Act was introduced, it really eroded our civil liberties, because one of the aspects of that is that you could now do what some would call illegal search and seizure. Mm-hmm. You could go into people's homes without any cause. You could track and trace phone numbers and listen to any conversations regarding what would be subversive activity. Mm-hmm. And today, that Patriot Act is still in effect. People can, in fact, be arrested. They can, in fact, be taken in without charges and so on. So for those of us who may not even know that this act exists, this act is on the books, and it can be enacted in times of social unrest. I mean, so if that's the case right now, Carlin, and we're seeing this whole thing come full circle, because now there is social unrest, and now there's militias that are literally gearing up today as we speak to be roaming the streets. We saw, for an example, the Biden bus in Austin was forcibly stopped, and they wouldn't allow them to go further. There was a story on one of our shows earlier this morning where they were saying a young lady had a Black Lives Matter bumper sticker. They surrounded her, tried to take her phone away. I mean, so we're seeing the budding ugly head, so to speak, of this social unrest that's emerging. So what happens next in your mind? Does this go away, or does this get worse?
Well, there's a lot that's going on there, because when you talk about the Patriot Act, you've got to look at what people at the time in history are willing to accept. The Patriot Act was easily passed because we had this sense of fear.
Right.
After 9/11 in 2001, we had this sense of fear, and we were willing to do whatever it took to obtain security for ourselves. And of course, it was bipartisan, very united, because everybody had the same feeling about it. And when you think about that, we did it. It eroded some of the civil liberties and now 20 years later, almost 20 years later, we're not feeling it as much. You know why? Because we're not as worried about terrorism from outside, but we are, of course, there's some concerns about what's happening inside. And so because of that, then people are beginning to raise these questions about how far can you go, or how far should we allow authorities to go with that. But and it's tough because and that's why I'm the apolitical guy, because there's good and bad on both sides. Because if you think about it, the fact that we don't have to worry about international terrorism, that's a very good thing, and may have some small part to do with the Patriot Act. And if you think about what happened with the governor in Michigan, was it last month, when the group that had domestic terrorists had a plot to take her, whatever. I guarantee you, they used some of that Patriot Act freedom to go to monitor these groups, to find out who these groups were, and they were able to stop that. And so it's, these things are bad in times of comfort and convenience, and when there's peace, they're very bad, and we can talk about them. But when we know that there's a real threat out there, then we really do want something to come and give us that security. So once again, the apolitical guy is saying there's some good and there's some bad, and we just need to understand and make sure that we're making proper use of what we've got.
Yes. Well, the GOP has traditionally wanted smaller government, less controls, less constraints. The Dems have always favored more regulation, more control, more ways to monitor, if you will, the citizens. And so there's this two diametrically opposed philosophies that are clashing around this whole notion that we are slowly losing our liberties. And we, after all, are the United States. We stand for freedom and justice, and we fought for these liberties and so on. I just heard a story out of England, London, England, where they said that they're currently debating this new legislation where if you speak out against the government or against certain conventional norms, you are considered someone who is using subversive speech, and you are therefore susceptible to arrest, not just sanction, but arrest. And now, England, last time I checked, was a democratic community. So there is now this movement of the goalposts, because we see that the social media, Twitter and Facebook and all these guys, they are now deciding, like this situation that happened with Biden and his son. All of a sudden, that's not newsworthy. That's false information. But is it?
Yeah. Wow, yeah.
So we're really on a slippery slope when it comes to the powers that be and what they want us to know and what they want us not to know.
Yeah, and that's the essence of where we are, because in decades past, we didn't have those players in the game. And so it was much easier to monitor, to control. But now with the advent of social media and what they're able to do, Jack Dorsey was put on the hot seat, and they called him in immediately. And it's kind of like your child steps out of line. Come in here. We don't sit down. Let's talk.
Yes.
And that's what they did. And they're going to do that more and more with Zuckerberg, and they're with all with the guys who at TikTok and all these. They're bringing all those guys to the carpet and saying, "You've got to answer here." And so that's the unknown, because they have the power. And there was a guy who, after 2016 election, talked about, and he was a Democrat, but he talked about how the next election. and you could probably go and find this guy out. But he was a Hillary Clinton supporter, but he was out saying that Google and these guys are going to have more influence in the 2020 election than previous because of what they were going to be able to do with the information that they were able to control.
Yes.
And so when you bring that in, then you've got a whole new dynamic. So when you start talking about civil liberties and things, it gets very complex. And that's why it's so important for us to have leaders in there who can bring people together. Let's talk about this in a way that we can constructively engage here and come up with solutions. Because other than that, because if you're reactionary to this thing, you're always going to be behind.
Yes.
And if you're behind, they've already done something. You know, Jack Dorsey there at Twitter's, you know, they called him after the fact. Well, he'd already shut down this stuff and said, and because I'd actually tried to pull up some of that stuff and it was gone immediately.
Yeah.
Imagine, so we're talking millions and millions and millions of people who don't get some information upon which to make a decision.
Correct.
So he is the controller.
Yes.
And that guy that's power. When you control the information,
that's right.
That's power.
You're right. Well, those gatekeepers of these mega information systems, which is really what they are now.
Yeah, that's what they are.
We are getting more of our news from social media than anywhere else. When you and I were kids, we used to have to go home at 6 o'clock or at 10 o'clock to watch what was happening in the world.
That's right.
That doesn't happen anymore. Your news is 24/7 on this thing. So we're really in this very tenuous time of social disinformation. And when you mention how social media will help determine the election, we have seen how the bots are pushing out misinformation about both candidates. And based on that, we heard about Russian interference in the last election. We heard about Chinese interference. And the understanding now is that China, Russia, and Iran, three of the axis of evil, so to speak, as we know them, are manipulating the outcomes because they are pushing a narrative on social media. So when we come back in our final segment, I kind of wanted to just unpack that a little bit more and just get your take on how people can start making their minds up for themselves and what that needs to look like. So, folks, you're listening to the Natural Nation Network. This has been the Voters Edition. We're going to take a brief break. When we come back, we're going to talk about how social media is impacting this new normal. Back in just a moment.
Every sports fan knows that the last few minutes can change the game. Texas has had record voter turnout, but it's not over yet. Voting is not a spectator sport. You have the power to change the game. We need everyone to get off the bench and get involved. We can't afford 4 more years of this administration. Get out and vote this Tuesday, November 3rd. Paid for by Texas Black Democratic PAC.
And we are back. This is the Natural Nation Network here on Edge Radio. I'm your host, Oscar Hines, joined by the interesting, inimitable. I've been enjoying this conversation with Carlin Charleston. Man, we are mixing this up. I hope y'all are enjoying this, folks, because this is a little bit off the norm. So you mentioned something, Carlin, just before the break about how social media has been affecting things, and what we've learned is that there are two big players in the social media space. Russia, which has basically their entire culture from the chess players of yesteryear in the 1950s and 20s or whatever. Russia has always been about compromising their opponent, about planning ahead, and about being strategic. Now, China has emerged as a tech giant. When they had TikTok, for an example, they were influencing outcomes of things on TikTok. So now we're in this place where everybody's getting their information from these devices. And what if the information is not true? How do we pick the sense from the nonsense in your mind?
Yeah, and it's just, and that's why I think so much of what we do has got to be old school relationships, communication across demographics and with other people. Because that's the only way to cut through, because it's kind of like these cars now. And you brought up China. China is supposedly, of course, they are the tech giant, and they're going to be the ones responsible for the EMP. If you know anything about that electromagnetic pulse, which will shut down all electronics in whatever grid they decide.
Can we make sure people understand what you just said? Because that's huge.
Yeah, and so the a lot of the work that's been done in the past, I guess you'd say in the past decade, whatever, has been people were talking about. Warfare is antiquated in the fact that there will never be these huge clashes of civilizations, tanks, and all this whatever, because what they are able to do with electromagnetic pulse, which is basically the design to shut down anything electronic. And now think about everything that's electronic. Cars, yes. Guys who work on old cars, they like the old ones before they introduced electronics into them, computers into them, because all these computers now. But with their capabilities and their ability to send out electromagnetic pulses, which will shut down, just basically fry electronics and shut down that whole system, then that's what they call the new warfare. Yes. And that's where it's going to happen. So you enter that in with what China has done with trade, and in their trade where they were doing all this exporting everywhere. And what were they exporting? They're exporting electronics. Yes. I mean, everybody's got some electronics from China. And so part of that is people are saying that they've already got these devices set up, so they created them, they can shut them down. So we've got all that. And so that's why it's important on the role that China is playing in all this. And then China connecting via social media as well, with TikTok and the things they're doing. So you've got a platform, you've got the ability now to do this thing. And so it just changes the whole situation, changes it up.
You know what I love about, I say I love about what you're saying, but listeners, I want you to really hear what this man is just saying. I really hope you get what we're talking about. Because when you have an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse, airplanes will drop out of the sky and they will crash to the ground. So every single thing run by a computer, not just these devices, every single thing, cars, everything will grind to a stop. So if you could immobilize a nation like the United States with an EMP, and it doesn't take more than one or two located in the right part of the country to literally shut down all of the infrastructure, now you've got people in the streets fighting, crawling over each other. There's no information. They don't know what's going on. They're spun into chaos. Now the government, who's relied on the emergency broadcast system, we started out in radio. Remember that little dot beep they used to say, this is the test of the emergency broadcast. Should there be an actual emergency? Now, those of us growing up around that, remember that. All of that's gone. You have no communication. You don't know how to get anywhere because you don't have GPS. You can't get money because all of the money is electronic. Everything shuts down. That is the formula for chaos. So we would literally be sent back to caveman times in a push of a button with something like that.
Yeah, if you look at some of the, there are lots of those apocalyptic movies, where I think Will Smith played in one, or
Right.
A Legend or whatever.
Right.
There are a lot of those movies, and when you look at those movies, I mean, they might be instructive for what it could look like if we don't attend to these things now and come up with ways to either negotiate our way out of them with some of these countries who are doing these things, or investigate them so that we can keep an eye on what's happening and actually know. Now, of course, we've got our CIA and we've got all of our investigative agencies who should be up to speed on what's going on there. But that information, and most Americans won't, of course, know this thing until it actually happens.
Exactly.
But we've got to be apprised of that. So when you hear the president, any of our presidents, begin talking about some of these foreign powers like China and Russia and Iran, you got to begin thinking about some of those things, because otherwise you're just saying, they're fomenting hate. Well,
Right.
it might be justified in some of these cases, and not to say that China's just all bad, but China is doing, we know, some bad. We do know that they're doing some bad. Not to say Russia's all bad, but we do know that they've been met in entire elections, whatever.
Right.
Not to say Iran is bad, but we do know what they've been doing with some of their own citizens. I mean, these are things we need to really begin thinking about. And here's why I push the unity thing, because as long as we're fighting each other, it's kind of like there's a great video that's out online, and you could probably go and Google it and find it. But there's these there are these two deer or antlers or whatever, some animal with